equally love the books I've written. I like some more than others. The book being reviewed today is one of my favorites. So I can be a bit touchy when others complain about it, or about this or that in it. In this regard, it is like my children. When others gripe about them, my instinct is to defend them. So this afternoon, I will defend my book. Before doing that, I wish to make clear what it's about. It's not polemic against Christian claims, even though my conclusions about some things, such as the fictional character of the resurrection of the saints in Matthew 27, have troubled some Christians. It's equally not apologetics, even though I state on page 1, as Gary notes, I believe that the disciples saw Jesus and that he saw them, and next Easter we'll find me in a church. My book is rather a collection of historical studies. I sometimes stray into theology, but only occasionally. Most chapters aspire to report even-handedly on a debated matter, offer critical commentary, and append suggestions. There's no overall thesis, no one point I'm trying to make. I'm just taking an excursion among the arguments, reporting what I see, and adding observations. I do so, it's important to emphasize, first of all, as a historian. My training is in modern biblical studies, and I belong to what may be fairly called the mainstream critical tradition. My teacher was W.D. Davies, whose teacher was C.H. Dodd, whose teacher was Adolf Harnack. That's my academic genealogy. I'm very proud of it. Additionally, I admire the old German liberals, such as Albert Schweitzer, who followed historical arguments wherever they led, whatever the theological fallout. I seek to emulate them. I don't, despite its problems, regret the Enlightenment, nor do I mourn the advent of modern biblical criticism. And I'm as much doubt seeking understanding as I am faith seeking understanding. Notwithstanding all that, my major historical conclusions in the resurrection of Jesus are conservative. You should all like me. Among them are these. Jesus was probably buried by somebody named Joseph of Arimathea. The tomb was probably discovered to be empty very soon thereafter. And belief in Jesus' resurrection goes back to week 1 after the crucifixion. I also endorse the sources when they report that Easter faith was in large measure a response to ostensible encounters with the post-mortem Jesus. While those are important conclusions, to my mind, the most interesting part of my book is part 3, Thinking with Parallels. Many apologists reflexively deny or relativize parallels between stories of Jesus' resurrection and all other phenomena. Their logic is this: if what happened to Jesus was utterly unique, then similarities with other events are beside the point. Skeptics, by contrast, are wont to call attention to and develop parallels in order to show that Christian claims are bogus. Their logic is this: if many have seen and heard what wasn't there, ghosts, the Virgin Mary, Bigfoot, then Jesus' disciples likely saw and heard what wasn't there. My project is different. Unlike most apologists, I don't dismiss or downplay parallels. I rather parade them. I refuse to ignore similarities because there are differences. Unlike skeptics, I don't marshal correlations in order to fashion a reductionistic explanation of Easter. My goal is instead to compare like with like, or with almost like, in order to enlarge understanding. While I believe that Jesus, after death, made himself known to his followers, I have no desire to bat away every intriguing parallel that comes into view. It's profitable, I believe, to think about apparitions, about Buddhist stories of rainbow bodies, about visions of Jesus through the ages, and about the incredible Marian apparitions that took place in Zaytun, Egypt during my lifetime. Comparison is instructive. One last point by way of introduction: I'm not a fightist or a Bardian. I'm not against scoring religious points when they can be scored. I'm an evidentialist when I think it's warranted. For example, I agree with Gary that near-death experiences are good evidence against reductionistic materialism and support the possibility of post-mortem existence. In addition, I think something can be said on behalf of fine-tuning arguments, and I doubt that all teleology can be credibly excised from biology. It's just that I don't believe that the evidence for Jesus' resurrection suffices to persuade if one is not otherwise inclined to be persuaded. It's not like the evidence for the crucifixion, which it'd be silly to dispute no matter what your worldview. Let me add that, however, as a Christian, I believe that the importance of a doctrine need have nothing to do with our ability to establish its probability via historical argumentation. Now on to issues raised by my respondents. I turn first to Jordan. He thinks our disagreements are minor, and that maybe very little in his presentation contradicts me. Well, I gladly disagree. I'm sorry, I gladly agree. I gladly agree. This is because, gladly agree. This is because he acknowledges the limitations of the historian qua historian, and above all, because he recognizes the importance of background beliefs or worldview. Those who infer that the resurrection hypothesis is the best explanation of apparent historical facts need to have certain antecedent beliefs and expectations, such as that there is a good God who cares about the affairs of this world and who would want to raise Jesus from the dead. I think this is correct in principle. Everything depends on what we bring to the evidence. In practice, however, I'm less confident as to how far natural theology can take us. Jordan is, for instance, more impressed with Swinburne's evaluation of some things than am I. I doubt that one can really make a case for incarnation or atonement the way Swinburne does through philosophical reflection. But that gets me off topic, by which I mean away from topics I discussed in my book. My volume is an exercise in the limits of historical criticism, not an exercise in the limits of natural theology. Let me then say something about Jordan's response to my claim that we shouldn't downgrade the skeptical hypothesis because it invokes multiple proposals. Thieves stole the body, Mary Magdalene hallucinated, and so on. Jordan's unconvinced by my observation on behalf of the skeptics that important historical events regularly have multiple and often disparate causes. He thinks we should not posit more causes than necessary when all else is equal. Yet I ask, when is all else ever equal for theist and non-theist? How did an unlettered man produce the Book of Mormon? How is it that several witnesses could swear to seeing plates of gold? How is it that a persecuted religious minority endured despite the odds? Mormons insist that acceptance of the one foundational fact that Joseph Smith was God's prophet has unrivaled explanatory power. From their point of view, not mine, not yours, aren't they right? For those of us who aren't Mormons, isn't the only counter to summon several independent assertions? Joseph Smith copied much of the Book of Mormon from an unpublished romance novel stolen from a Pittsburgh printing shop. The witnesses to the golden plates were naive or of dubious character. Sociological parallels show well enough how persecution can grow a sectarian movement, and so on. We use a scattershot strategy whenever we explain away the narratives others tell about themselves. How can we do anything else? And how then can we object when somebody does it to our religion? I have more disagreements with my friend Mike. He believes that I set the bar too high sometimes with regard to the burden of proof, and he also seems nonplussed that I quote folks from previous centuries who make assertions such as, taking all the evidence together, it's not too much to say that there is no single historical incident better or more variously supported than the resurrection of Christ. According to Mike, apart from perhaps one or two contemporary exceptions of which I'm aware, I know no serious scholar or apologist today who claims that the data demands belief in the resurrection or renders every naturalistic alternative impossible. So I'm on the verge of shooting at straw men. Yet, as Mike says in a footnote he didn't read, Tom Wright and Richard Swinburne seem to be exceptions. They are indeed, and they're serious scholars. And they're among the most prominent of recent defenders of Jesus' resurrection. They're not straw men, but powerful influences with which to reckon. It's not amiss to respond to them. But setting that to the side, if apologists don't claim that the evidence demands a verdict, what do they claim? Mike affirms that the evidence is truly suggestive. It may not demand a verdict, but it does suggest one. What does Mike mean? I think he means that to judge by the extant historical evidence, it's more probable than not that Jesus rose. As he puts it, Jesus' resurrection is a thesis that in its explanatory scope and power is superior, but I want to ask, superior to whom? Not to someone without preconceptions, because there's no such person. To someone with no existential investment and nothing but objective curiosity about a purely historical issue? Who would that be? To someone with no antecedent sense of the likelihood or unlikelihood of resurrection? Again, who would that be? I understand how atheists and Christians can inhabit the same argumentative box when they debate the date of the confession in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, or whether Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus. But atheists and Christians don't inhabit the same argumentative box when they discuss whether a dead man became undead. That's a very different sort of animal. It's entangled in metaphysical beliefs in a way that the story of the burial or the pre-Pauline creed in 1 Corinthians 15 is not. And my contention remains that the New Testament doesn't supply the sort of evidence that must topple a well-considered, firmly held, non-Christian worldview. While the purely historical evidence is consistent with the belief, which I hold, that God raised Jesus from the dead, it's not so strong as to make this belief unreasonable. I concur, this is really important, I concur with Mike and others here, that elements in the skeptical scenario aren't very likely. But that's not to the point. For convinced skeptics, and by the way, I just take their existence for granted. I don't ask in my book whether they should exist at all. For convinced skeptics, a dead man coming back to life is also not very likely. Indeed, it's far less likely than thieves stealing somebody's body. So opting for a skeptical scenario, which so many do, isn't irrational. When your choice is between two improbabilities, you're stuck with an improbability. Regarding Mike and apparitions, he doesn't deny that I've accurately cataloged many parallels between modern accounts of apparitions and stories of the risen Jesus, but citing the work of Jonathan Kendall, he responds that there are significant differences. Now, parallels always come with differences. Were one to compare two things and find no differences, they would be the same thing. Comparison involves weighing dissimilarities beside similarities. In the present case, I freely acknowledge, as Mike notes, the dissimilarities between what's claimed about Jesus and what's been claimed about others. Nonetheless, does the fact that one can find apparitional parallels to just about everything in the stories about the risen Jesus really mean nothing? Let me try an analogy. If you read through a modern critical commentary on Matthew, you'll quickly learn that almost every saying attributed to Jesus has a parallel of some sort in Jewish literature. That is, the Old Testament, Second Temple sources, or rabbinic literature. Now, one could assert that this is of no account, because those parallels are scattered hither and yon, true enough, and because Matthew's picture of Jesus makes him different from all other teachers, true enough. Wouldn't it be odd to claim that therefore all the parallels tell us nothing? I believe that they at least imply that Jesus, whatever else may be true of him, was heavily indebted to Jewish tradition, including extra-biblical tradition. The many and manifest dissimilarities don't annul the point about the similarities. Now, regarding Jesus' resurrection, the accounts of the resurrection appearances contain uncanny circumstances that match visionary experiences better than everyday seeing. John 20 reports that during evening on that day, the first day of the week, the doors were locked where the disciples were, yet Jesus came and stood among them. Clearly, he pops into the room here. Solid bodies don't do this. Apparitions do. They appear and disappear in abrupt and unusual ways. John 20 says, 20:26 says the same thing. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them. Ordinary physical bodies don't pass through material walls. Apparitions do. They have four-dimensional mobility. Again, when Jesus walks down the Emmaus Road with two disciples, they fail to recognize him. They catch on only when he sits with them at table and then inexplicably vanishes. Is this really Jesus in his old physical body? Why then don't they recognize him? Then there's Mary Magdalene. When Jesus appears to her in John 20, she mistakes him for a gardener? How can that be if he's just as he always was? Now, I don't really know what's going on here, folks, in these stories. But Origen, the great Origen, sensing how strange all this is, and it's really strange. Wake up, it's really strange. Surmise that Jesus existed. How strange is this? Existed in a sort of intermediate body between the grossness of that which he had before his sufferings and the appearance of a soul uncovered by such a body. Well, I don't know what's going on, but I do think that the appearances seem, in some respects, to be vision-like. More vision-like than like ordinary perception. Doesn't that mean something? What's the explanation? Now, as to what Mike says about agency, he offers 5 historical items that, taken together, make it reasonable to infer divine agency for Jesus' resurrection. I wish it were this easy. But Sabbatai Tzvi, the 16th century Jewish Messiah, spoke and acted as though divine. His followers attributed miracles to him, and some of them believed that he exited his grave. That's 3 of Mike's 5 points. Let me focus, however, on another of Mike's 5 points. Jesus predicted his death and resurrection. I don't understand how this helps the apologist's case. A skeptic could retort that Jesus prophesied death and resurrection because he believed, as much mainstream scholarship holds, the end to be near, when great tribulation would arrive and martyrs would fall, after which God would raise the dead. And the skeptic would say, after his death, Jesus' disciples transmuted prophecy into fulfillment. If you know anything about millenarian movements, claiming the fulfillment of prophecy is par for the course. It's just what they do. What Mike takes to be evidence for faith, the skeptic could easily construe as evidence against faith. One last point regarding Mike's response. I claim that even if the apologists were to make it likely that Jesus rose from the dead, this doesn't clearly confirm the Christian interpretation. Some Hindus and Buddhists and New Agers interpret the resurrection in terms of their tradition. Mike protests we should endorse the disciples' interpretation because it draws on first-hand experience in close proximity to the events. Everything else is a retrofit. Well then, I ask Mike now, publicly, what does Mike do with the Marian apparitions at 𝐬𝐸, Egypt? I'm convinced that there is no credible, reductionistic, or skeptical account for these. We have here a spectacularly authenticated series of religious events without explanation. If you doubt this, just read Travis Dumsday's book from last year, The Marian Apparitions at 𝐬𝐸, an Evidential Inquiry. Now, the vast majority of first-hand witnesses, which in terms of numbers dwarfs the 500 of 1 Corinthians, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people, believe that they saw Mary. Reading their testimonies is a riveting experience, and to be candid, leaves me utterly baffled. I'll return to this. Were I a Coptic Christian, the explanation would be obvious. It's Mary. But I'm not a Coptic Christian, and so hesitate, despite the evidence being truly suggestive, to endorse their interpretation of the sightings. Because of my theology, I find it hard to think that the apparition of 𝐬𝐸 was Mary, the Mother of God. My guess is that Mike would also find this hard. In doing so, however, he'd be declining the interpretation of those closest to the inexplicable events. But that's just fine with me, because Mike and I, as outsiders, have to interpret the religious ideas of others from our point of view. The non-Christian is going to do exactly that when it comes to Jesus' resurrection. Now to Andrew. I don't have time to offer a detailed response. Let me quickly just offer some clarifications and ask some questions. First, I want to emphasize that my book speaks on behalf of 2 skeptics, and I guess this sometimes confuses people. The first skeptic is me. I'm skeptical about some things, such as what we can know about the appearances to the 500, or the appearance to the 500. But there's a second skeptic who is not me, but whom I speak for as devil's advocate. This is the skeptic who disbelieves in Jesus' resurrection and is a reductionist about everything. When I defend this skeptic, I'm not defending my personal beliefs. I'm only urging that this second sort of skeptic isn't, given his assumptions, not my assumptions, irrational. Second, Andrew, unlike Jordan, says nothing about worldview. He seems to be affirming that one should infer on historical grounds alone that Jesus rose from the dead, and that no other position is reasonable. Is this correct? Is Andrew urging that every skeptical scenario can be falsified, that is, demonstrated through pure historical reason to be false without question? Third, Andrew has a lot to say about the appearance to the 500, yet everything hinges on one Greek sentence written by somebody who wasn't there. Technically, it's hearsay and wouldn't be allowed as testimony in a U.S. courtroom. Furthermore, we don't know when or where this event happened, nor the identity of the people involved, nor why they were gathered, nor who gathered them, nor how many knew Jesus well, nor the nature of the appearance. We just don't know anything. Andrew does his best to play Sherlock Holmes here. It's fascinating to watch him, adding inference to inference. But I remain unpersuaded. I guess we just have different historical sensibilities here. Fourth, I just disagree regarding the parapsychologists who've collected numerous instances of collective visions. I can't dismiss all the indubitably first-hand testimony they've gathered. To read through Phantasms of the Living or Meyer's Human Personality and the Survival of Bodily Death and Terrell's Apparitions is to be confronted by a slew of carefully gathered and well-documented testimonies from sincere people. I just don't get it. To dismiss these materials with a comment about occasional fraud baffles me. And by the way, nothing in the New Testament went through a peer review process. Finally, part of Andrew's case depends on stories featured in Luke, Acts, and John, stories where Jesus eats and is touched. Why couldn't a skeptic with an utterly clear conscience be content to observe that these sources were written decades after the events, that they're not clearly independent? A lot of us think John had heard Luke, and that they don't come from first-hand witnesses. Luke certainly wasn't there, and the skeptic could appeal to the great cloud of academic witnesses who disbelieve that John, the son of Zebedee, wrote the fourth gospel. Won't the skeptic just rest easy here? But I'm running out of time, so on to Gary. I don't claim that the evidence for Mormonism is highly evidential. I'm not a Mormon, Gary. I write rather that the signed testimony of witnesses inside the cover of the Book of Mormon is, and I quote, highly evidential until one reads some non-Mormon sources, which I have. That is, until one learns additional facts. And when I write that we have nothing comparable from Christian origins, I was referring only to signed affidavits from eyewitnesses, nothing more. Just two more quick points. First, Gary stresses that mainstream psychology journals don't report collective visions. My response is, well, of course they don't. Reductionistic materialism dominates mainstream modern science and its publications. Those publications aren't going to carry reports of collective visions deemed to be veridical. That would contradict their prevailing worldview. Collective veridical visions aren't in the journals for the same reason that miracles don't show up in the mainstream history journals. But the reports are certainly there. You've all read Craig Keener. The reports are also there for veridical collective visions. William James is to the point. By far the most usual way of handling phenomena so novel that they would make for a serious rearrangement of our preconceptions is to ignore them altogether. Yes. Finally, another word about the appearances at 𝐧𝐯𝐢𝐞𝐿. Gary says I'm not convinced by them. Well, I'm not convinced it was Mary, but that's pure theological bigotry on my part. I am convinced, and this is my main point in the book, that the series of events is inexplicable in mundane or reductionistic terms. Here's one report. At about 9:50, this is a group of 7 people, saw lightning over the church, much stronger than one could make with a flashlight. I had a feeling something was about to happen. A thin line or edge of light appeared like the light you see when you open the door to a lighted room. Within seconds, it formed itself into the shape of the Virgin. I could not speak. All who were with me said, "It is impossible." The Muslims all started to cry. The sight lasted for 5 minutes, when the figure rose and vanished. When she disappeared from our side of the church, the people from the other side shouted they were seeing her. Then she returned to our side for another 5 minutes. When I returned to the car for something, I found it impossible to get back to the church because of the crowd. But above the center dome, I saw Mary in full body standing before the cross. Now we have, I'm not exaggerating, literally hundreds of such first-hand accounts. Literally hundreds on paper. Many of them recorded while the events were ongoing. And we got some photos. And I know that at least 3 of these photos are early because I have them from 1969 or 70 myself. And reports of healings. Even today you can talk to people who were there, and in my experience, without exception, they're sure they saw Mary. Not a nebulous light that they interpreted to be Mary. Were I a convinced skeptic or materialist, the 𝐳𝐯𝐢𝐞𝐿 would really bother me. And I confess it would bother me more than the New Testament evidence for Jesus' resurrection. Happily for me, however, I'm neither materialist nor skeptic. Happily for you, my time is up. Thank you.